Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
And today we are very fortunate to be joined by a renowned scientist and also a local San Diegan who is benefiting, as I am, from the end of May gray, June gloom, July we didn't fry. It's finally clear. It's August 2nd, and I'm joined by Dr. Eric Topol. How are you today, Dr. Topol?
Brian, it's so great to be with you. Thank you for having me with you.
I followed you for years. Obviously, you're a renowned scientist, cardiologist, executive vice president at Scripps Institution, which is not to be confused with Scripps Institute of Oceanography. I made that mistake in the past. We had on Luca Leggiani, who's at Scripps Institution. He works on Origin of Life. We talked about Origin of Life, Primo Levi. This is Life Month on the Into the Impossible podcast. But before we get into all these physics and kind of nerd out on physical sciences, I want to do what I do, Eric, with all my guests who write books, and you've written at least 3 that I've read. I like to play a game called Judging Books by Their Cover, because what other prior do you have to go on when you see a book? And so I want to ask you, this book, Deep Medicine, I have your other book, The Patient Will See You Now, in another room. But this book, Deep Medicine, what is the origin of the title and the subtitle and the cover design, which seems to have a menacing android with an apple?
Right. Well, Deep Medicine was easy because this is about how deep learning, the subtype of AI, will affect the future of medicine and healthcare. And, I think in many ways, one of my influencers was Gary Kasparov, who had a book, Deep Thinking. And it's a natural. It's deep everything, as you know, Brian. All the different methods and acronyms, everything surrounding the deep learning era is deep. And what's the play on words here is that rather than everybody thinking about the AI impact, it's much more about restoring humanity, going deep in terms of the human connection. And that's what I think is the counterintuitive notion. So then that picture of the Android with the apple was trying to capture that sense, is that we can make with AI medicine better, healthier, and restore the human connect, which is the whole notion that most people haven't realized, that the gift of time, that if you harness what AI can do between all the different things like the assimilation of the data, processing the data that no human being can actually keep up with anymore. So that, and the idea that, for example, doctors and clinicians are at keyboards typing and not even looking at patients. And, why that? Well, you would use voice and natural language processing and get synthetic notes. And there's a long, long list of things that would make that patient-doctor relationship back to the way it was supposed to be, back where it was years ago when I first got out of medical school.
Yeah, and I want to also point out that I know that you have many awards and honors in addition to your leadership at Scripps Institution. But I want to also point out that you were named, if I'm not mistaken, 2017 Sharpie Highlighter Man of the Year for all your highlights that you do in your tweets. And I decided I would start emulating you when I heard you speak. You are perhaps the most prolific highlighter in human history. And I say that based on your meeting you in real life and seeing you on Twitter, where you're been a godsend to many of us who are data-driven and like to think about data, et cetera, more or less continuously. And I do want to get into the opportunities that you presented to me and to the audience back at Scripps when you gave a lecture when this book came out. But also, yeah, as you mentioned in The Patient Will See You Now, you kind of had this depiction at one point, I remember in a talk you gave, of like a in the olden days, it was like a doctor looking at a chart and the patient sitting there talking. And now it's like a doctor typing into a computer. And I think about that with education in that, 1,000 years ago in Bologna, Italy, the first university was started. And you're also a professor at Scripps as well. And those first professors, think of how much has changed. It was a man with a piece of rock scraping on another piece of rock, writing down something. And then there were students were transferring it to their pieces of rock or papyrus. I don't know what they had back then, to be honest, Eric. But the point is, nothing has changed in education. it to like, if you were explaining it, maybe, yeah, we have these devices and now the kids are recording instead of typing notes or writing notes by hand. But it strikes me as how little has changed in hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And we're kind of at this level. As I had on Carl Wyman, who won the Nobel Prize in 2001, who's now turned his life to educational overhaul. And he said, he claimed we're at the point in education that's equivalent to bloodletting with leeches. But I want to ask you, what is medicine at? How come medicine is so resistant? Is it all lawyers? Is it because of lawyers, or why is it that we don't have an artificial intern in the room with all my doctors?
Yeah, great question, Brian. I think one of the big reasons why medicine is so sclerotic, so difficult to change, and as you say, many things are a throwback to more than 2 millennia. The era of Hippocrates, where the doctor knows best about everything and is in command and control of everything. And so letting go is difficult. And it's not just a legal thing. It's much more, it's this thing of I'm in charge. I'm trained to be in charge. And also I'm going to live in an analog world. Part of that analog world was that the first foray into the digital world in medicine were these electronic health records, which have been an abject, a total fiasco, because what it's done is it basically really undermined that relationship, as you've already touched on. And the problem is that that's not a good proxy for where digital and where things like AI can take us. And so a lot of physicians, where they were forced to change, their health system said, you must use electronic records. We're getting rid of paper records. And it was all done for billing purposes. It wasn't done to, provide better medical care. So with that, the first chance to adopt the digital era in healthcare, it backfired in many respects. So between what you mentioned, the medical legal issues, the control issues, the bad experiences, sour experiences, it's been hard to get any real substantive change in medicine.
And I look at, the work of your colleague and friend Atul Gawande and his book, The Checklist Manifesto. There is kind of rationalizing, systematizing, and I'm a private pilot. I fly little tiny Cessnas around. But the point being, we've learned, because the lessons are written in blood in aviation, that you have to learn from the mistakes of others, because you won't live long enough to make them all yourself, as Rickover said. But I guess the thing that strikes to me as even more similar is that like artificial intelligence could be in the cockpit too. In other words, every time I fly, from Montgomery Field or whatever, and I fly around to go to, Los Angeles or something like that, I have to tune in by hand a radio dial, and I have to listen analog single channel communication to the weather there, because there could be a broken down plane on the runway, and so it changes every hour. And then I have to write that down by hand. Like, what if I had and I won't say the word, but it sounds like Alexandria or Cyril. And I had one of these devices in the cockpit with me that was connected, because it's connected to the internet through 5G or whatever. And it strikes me as just, as you say, sclerotic, because that would save lives. I mean, there's no doubt that there have been lives lost because either someone didn't tune the right frequency, didn't know there was something that prevented them from being able to land, for example. And probably in medicine too, there's people that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Brian, you're really apt to point that out, because the problem we have with medicine today is, this term precision medicine's used a lot, and that doesn't mean much if you keep making the same mistakes. That's very precise. We need accuracy. And that's actually the short-term big benefit of AI. Deep neural networks you start to see all the trends, particularly with medical images, of making things far more accurate. That is, when you get the processing that can be done through training neural nets of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of, whether it's mammograms or x-rays, CAT scans, any type of medical image, you can do things that no one would have anticipated in terms of revving up accuracy. And when you add the human oversight, then you've got kind of the best of both worlds. So that's why medicine is in the midst, I would say in the early midst of a shakeup, because the machine plus the clinician is going to be the new look rather than just the clinician, because accuracy is not anywhere near it needs to be. In fact, the National Academy of Medicine has documented that each of us will have a serious medical error happen to us in our lifetime. At least one. That's pretty bad. And then when you also think about the 40% of doctors, when a patient dies and they have an autopsy, and before the autopsy, they say 40% of the time, that is, they know exactly what was the cause of death. And the autopsy, 40% of the time, shows they're absolutely wrong. So we have a lot of hubris,
Right.
we have a lot of inaccuracy, and we need help. We need to lean on machines to help us.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's, again, in the aviation, the military, they've learned this. I had David Marquet on the podcast last year, and he was talking about his book, Turn the Ship Around, and leadership is language. And he told me the most dangerous word a leader, a surgeon, a pilot, someone can say is the word right, ? I say to you, Eric, I'm not going to suffer from COVID, right? And you're in a position of authority. It's coercive, it's manipulative, it's prone to confirmation bias. And I just wonder, I always harken back to the Talmud, which is the second holiest book in Judaism. And the Talmud has a famous phrase, I don't know if you ever heard it, the best doctors go to hell. Because we do, and I extend that to PhD doctors of my type. So it's not the worst doctor. It's because we kind of have this theme that Atul and you have talked about, this kind of aura of invincibility, this expert authority bias. And yet, how do you walk the tightrope? Because we need authorities. We live in an anti-scientific age. And yet we have a natural desire to also want to be free and have liberty in this country, unlike other countries. And so, how do you balance that as a doctor, as a public figure who's perhaps one of the most vocal, supporters of the scientific method in the public discourse? How do you balance those two, the competition for liberty on one side and the competition for following experts when it's warranted?
Yeah, it's a very important and delicate balance, because what I want to see is democratizing medicine. So many people now can capture their own data, and with support of algorithms, they can do doctorless things. But of course, doctors don't want them to do that for the most part. And so we have to let go. But we also obviously want to have this stuff validated with scientific method, that it really works, that no one's getting hurt, that it, leads to the right screening, whether it's skin cancers and lesions or urinary tract infections, ear infections of children, heart rhythm. All these things can now be obtained with a reasonable accuracy by a person without a doctor.
Right.
So this is really where this change, this shift is occurring, because algorithms don't just help clinicians. They help all people if they're used properly. But we have a problem. Our little problem is that so little has been validated. So we can't be pushing this too hard until we get compelling evidence that it works really well.
Yeah, I had Dr. Peter Diamandis on last year, and he's famous for let's democratize all these 5 Ds, probably because his name is Diamandis, has so many Ds in it. But, he's obviously on the cutting edge of a lot of medical research, but also on, kind of the exponential, all these different exponentials that come into play. I think it's fascinating that, we never has there been, to misquote Carl Sagan, never has so much data been available to so many people who don't know how to use it. It's like there's it'd be great if we could actually have the kind of supervising agent, not have to be so hard to come about in terms of a trained doctor. Let me ask you a bigger picture question. I want to take you back to college, and you're sleeping you're chatting with your buddies on the couch in the dorm, or maybe you got a beverage of your adult variety. And I want to speculate, when I say life, what is life to you? There's a famous paper monograph by Erwin Schrödinger, Nobel Prize winner for creation of wave mechanics, quantum mechanics. He wrote a monograph. It had some cool things in it, like hinted that there might be some crystal inside life that stores information. What is life to you, Doctor?
Oh, Brian, that's a tough one. There's a recent book by Carl Zimmer, who's a real good friend and journalist of the New York Times, that, several hundred pages that gets into this. It's not an easy answer. I mean, you could say, is a virus life? Like,
that's my next
COVID,
question.
Right?
That's my next question.
And you could say, well, not really, unless it can get into a host, right? And then it sure is a hell of a life and causing death. But of the hosts, and so it's tricky because if you want to talk about independent ability to sustain itself versus being able to invade and then basically hijack a host of any kind, there's lots of fine lines between life here and sub-life forms. So in the true sense, it would be, that an organism that can sustain itself, replicate itself, perhaps. But I think we have to think more broadly than that.
And then when I say artificial intelligence, my friend Max Tegmark at MIT was on the show. He's a proponent of this concept that he calls Life 3.0. That actually artificial intelligence has all the characteristics that could plausibly, from a physicist's point of view, perhaps, be ascribed to a living organism. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think Max's book, 3.0, is actually very provocative. I enjoyed it. I haven't met Max, but I certainly think he's a sharp thinker. I don't want to give AGI, which he forecasts will be 2045 with his big conference that he pulled together. If that ever happens, maybe he'd be right. But right now, I'm not thinking 2045 or beyond that. And I don't know that I would give AGI assigning life potential yet. And we'll have to see whether that actually pans out.
One of the things I've gotten interested in is kind of taking the words of the great maestro of physics, Galileo, for the first time, making the first ever audiobook with some colleague, Carlo Rovelli and others. And when I had the audio, I actually realized that there is no audiobook of any of Galileo's works, which is really a tragedy. So I'm rectifying that. But I said, actually, I have the text. So could I put that into GPT-3 and make artificial Galileo, or as I call him, Galileo, and start doing things with it? But then it started to dawn on me that, so Einstein, you may or may not know this, he called the realization of what's known as the equivalence principle, that if you're in free fall, you experience no gravitational force. So even if you're near, that's the sensation that you have when you go over a hill or in a plane or something like that. Or if you're in a rocket in deep space, you're moving at 1G, you can't tell you're not in a gravitational field stationary on the Earth. He called that, Eric, the happiest thought of his life. And I started thinking, first of all, could a computer experience happiness, number one? And then number two, could it even relate? What does it mean to feel like you're free falling? And so I agree with you. I'm actually an AI pessimist, or GAI. I don't think that it will be in the same, as I quote, often. You mentioned Kasparov. He was beaten by Deep Blue. I know computers can now defeat any human in chess. Can they create the game of chess? Can computers eventually come up with new ways of treating, come up with some new idea? Oh, actually, you have to remove all the mitochondria from every. I don't know. The last thing I had in biology, Eric, was ninth grade. I dissected a frog. I got it all wrong. The frog lived. The frog actually lived. I don't know how. I'm such a failure. But yeah, are there opportunities for completely, de novo innovations in either machine learning and from deep neural networks, like you talk about in here, or in AI? Is there any possibility we could just think so outside the box, literally the silicon box, that it could really surprise us in the way that Einstein was surprised in a similar fashion?
Well, I think it's speculative. We haven't seen it yet. We have seen, amazing things that we have to be imaginative, that we can train machines with the right inputs to get outputs that were not envisioned. But what you're getting at is could the autonomous aspect of neural nets to be able to do things that, without any guidance whatsoever. I don't know about that. I'm much more skeptical that that's going to be happening. But, there are these people that have, the doomsayers, like Elon Musk and several others that have basically, gone that direction. It's possible. I don't think we've seen any good evidence of it. But I also would say, right now, deep learning is the vogue, it's the main thing that we harp on. But there are lots of new models that are going to be come up with in the years ahead. And, anything's possible. We should be open to potential, and watch for that. But I don't see it. I'm more like you on this, not having heard your views previously.
And one of my favorite chapters in Deep Medicine is a chapter called Deep Empathy. Can you explain what that means for people that haven't read the book? What does deep empathy mean?
Right. So, you already, in a way, came onto this with this assigning human qualities to machines, which is wrong because there's no reason to get anthropomorphic with the machines. So they're not going to have empathy. You just can't do that. That is, I remember in the book I had a table before that chapter about all the things that humans do that machines can't really do, whether it's cry or laugh or have true empathy, and on and on. But the deep empathy, the final chapter, the culmination of the book is how we get back this deep connection between the patient and the clinician, because it's what it's all about. That's what the essentiality of medicine. And yeah, you can have help with a machine to get to get the right diagnosis or even to guide towards the right treatment. But all of that is unimportant, because when you're sick, you want a human looking after you. You want to know that a human has your back. And so that's deep empathy, having your back, having a presence, a trust, all the qualities that are humanoid that we don't have enough of today because we don't have the gift of time.
One of my favorite tweets that you had pinned as on your Twitter profile, where you've got nigh on 500,000 followers that are rabid and love it in the best sense. I shouldn't say rabid to a physician; that could be taken the wrong way. But you had a tweet pinned for a long time, and it was just your medical data. And it strikes me that you're one of the more, along with Abdaal and others, very patient focused. But I want to take a step back, because I teach a lot of pre-meds at UCSD in physics. They have to take, physics 1 series, and I guess, and they think it's just to get past the MCATs. I wish that they would actually learn it in a more provocative and actually intellectual fashion. But we do have to do that, and so it's what they do. A friend of a friend who's a famous podcaster in England. He's a doctor, Ali Abdaal. He has 2 million followers, on YouTube. Anyway, he did a survey. He dropped out of being, he was Cambridge trained physician, OBGYN, and he decided he's going to stop. And he asked, because he became a millionaire. He became a millionaire from YouTube and he runs a bunch of courses and how to study for med school and so forth. And he surveyed a bunch of his friends that are doctors and said, if you became a millionaire, would you keep practicing? And most of the answers, Eric, came back as yes, until the end of the day. In other words, there's so much dissatisfaction, there's so much burnout, there's so much stress among your fellow physicians that I wonder, who speaks for them? And is that a crisis? This crisis of meaning or burnout? What do you make of that?
Yeah, no, you're spot on about that. So we have a global crisis of burnout, the highest rate of clinical depression, suicides ever in the medical profession, not even just among doctors, but nurses and other disciplines. It's actually horrific. The pandemic has put medicine in a bright light in terms of heroes, if you will, but it hasn't gotten over this problem of loss of mission. So the point being here is that when you only have 7 minutes to see patients, and 12 minutes for a new patient that you've never seen before, you basically are violating why you did this for your life, because you did it because you care for people, you want to care for people, you want to look after them, and you can't. So that's what leads to profound disenchantment, is unable to cope with the system of how you are basically supposed to be practicing medicine. That has to change. And the overlords, basically in medicine, unlike your walk of life, are managers, bean counters, and they want you to see more patients in any given time slot. So that doesn't work out too well. So the only way we get over this is that we have to revolt. We have to tell the managers that no, we're not doing this anymore. We want to look after patients, because if we don't do that, it's hard to break this progressive crisis, global disenchantment and depression. It's been building, over many years.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about, kind of how these students come up and the shortage of physicians, I had Michael Saylor, who's a very big proponent of Bitcoin. Not that we're going to get into that, but he's one of them. And anyway, he started this new university basically for STEM, and it's called Saylor Academy. And he basically feels like unless you're going to be, like a sculptor or major in professional golf, I don't know. Well, I'm talking to a doctor, so maybe you can major in professional golf. I don't know. But but the point is, like, for at least for not physical interactions, maybe there is some part of the bedside, manner that you can't teach. But, could we, kind of lessen the pressure on the existing cadre of doctors by having just more and more students get into medicine, and by doing so, lower the cost of medical school, make it more affordable, make there more teachers, et cetera. Why have Brian Keating, teach physics when you can have Galileo or Einstein using AI and all the words they've ever spoken? Do you see an opportunity, or would it make the problem worse to have more people become physicians? Would you just have a greater number of suicides and sort of negative mental health outcomes?
Well, it's a very good, insightful question. The problem is right now the workforce, the human capital that's being expended is making healthcare unsustainable. So we have to be smarter about that. And the question is, of course, if we got more frontline people, like you're alluding to, and stop with all these administrators and managers whose role is more questionable. That's one strategy. But the other one is to rely much more on support that we can get from machines that can make each doctor's life so much easier and more accurate. So I think it's a combination of those two, not one or the other.
And so I think that dovetails nicely into kind of transitioning to rather current events. Let's call it current events. There's been a pervasive worldwide pandemic for the last 16 or more months.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Are you familiar with this? Because I have a doctor, a friend of mine. I happen to know Eric Topol, so I could interview. I could put you in touch. But well, first of all, I want to get your just as a human being. So I remember in January 2020, I'd just been invited to go to a conference in Tibet, of all places, and
Wow.
I was looking forward to it. I'd never been to China, to Tibet, and I went to dinner, and I was next to a friend of mine, my friend Mitch, and he was saying, you might want to hold off on that a little bit, because I just heard China's building this hospital, and they're so much far in advance of America that they built the hospital in 7 days, and it can hold 1,000 people. And it also doubles maybe as some other. Anyway, I don't want to get into politics, but the point was they were my friend Mitch, who's not like a global policy medical health pandemic expert, or doesn't have the $1 trillion NSA budget, CIA budget, whatever, all these three little DARPA, whatever. He knew about it. He knew it was not a good idea. He knew it was coming to America and Canada. How come we failed so badly to diagnose this? And it wasn't like we didn't know it could happen, but with all the apparatus. In other words, not just like, oh, well, we had a bad president or a good whatever. Again, I'm not political. I'm a political atheist. And I think I got into astronomy, Eric, just a sign up, because there are no Republican constellations. There's no Democratic asteroid over there. I love it because I think we need a politics-free space as intellectuals in society. But anyway.
I agree with that. Just like there's not a Democratic or Republican virus either, right?
Yes, exactly.
So the issue here is that we were flat-footed, and the biggest singular problem why the U.S. got so deep into a horrible mess is that we had no testing capability for the first 2 months of the pandemic here. And so without testing, we watched unknowingly the diffuse spread of the coronavirus, everywhere. And so that was the time when you needed to have, it was basically invisible to us. And the only way to see it would have been to do nasopharyngeal swabs and PCR. So we blew it. And now we're trying to dig out. And, it's just really, when you get that far behind, 2 months, I mean, as you know, talk about exponential stuff, right? You're in deep shit. I mean, and we are still in many ways from that. Now, had we been all over it, like Iceland is an example. You say, oh, well, that's just an island country. It's only got 300,000 people. But hey, they were testing people randomly before the pandemic ever reached there. That's the way to be, right? Mm-hmm. And so you look at the countries that got to zero COVID, and they were basically all over it from the get-go. Now, you could say in the second part of the story, they're all basically naive. They have no immunity. And so they have to also be smart about getting vaccine-induced immunity, but at least to get through and have unscathed. I have a faculty appointment at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. I talk to my colleagues, frequently. And to think that they basically have had a normal life, never been affected by COVID, except for a few days here and there, because they got all over it from the beginning, and they've stayed all over it. And they're also doing well now in the vaccination phase. So there are ways that we could have done so much better, and it was just mismanaged. And I think our public health resources were gutted, systematically gutted over many years. So we were in a poor position to react. And even knowing, when the sequence of the virus was available on January 10th from China, that was the triumph of the American medicine life science community of getting the vaccines, compressed schedule, all the way, highly successful vaccines, all the way through clinical trials and rolling out within 10 months. That's amazing. So you have, the best and the worst, right? You have what the U.S. is very good at, which is on the life science industry and ingenuity side, but on the public health, pitiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that, especially as a parent of young kids and seeing, just kind of the various whipsawing I felt like over the past year and a half, and still feeling like, oh, now we've got this Delta variant.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked a little bit about this in a wonderful chat with Sam Harris a couple weeks ago, but I want to ask you, like when they say, this is spreading and we have a new wave, et cetera, how different in terms of viral, if you just took, the PCR of it, first of all, how do they know it's, if someone goes in the hospital in San Diego, God forbid, and they have COVID, how do they actually test and say, oh, this is a Delta person, not versus do they do that? Or
well, in San Diego, we're very lucky because we have, if not the most sequencing, maybe the second most sequencing of anywhere in the country.
Right.
And so fortunately, our collaboration at Scripps Research with UCSD and Helix and Illumina, we're all over this. So we do sequence the samples. And interestingly, to that point, Brian, when we had the original virus and then the Alpha variant and the other variants before Delta, we could hardly ever sequence the virus in the samples. There was so little there. Now, every one of them can be sequenced because there's so much. And the key thing here is that it's 1,000-fold more viral load. So when you get the chance of overriding vaccines even can occur. But moreover, the people who are unvaccinated are just spreading this like no other previous version of the virus. It's just so super contagious, unfortunately. And that's why it's causing real havoc, and not as much yet in California, hopefully, but it certainly is in many other states in the country.
And looking at the, the data and seeing, the prevalence of both of hospitalization with and without vaccination, I think it's really clear. And I got the vaccine at UCSD. I think we had one of the best response. I was never more proud to be at UCSD. We had vending machines with test swab kits. I could get it whenever I wanted. We had, distance. We had masks. We did it all. As soon as the vaccine was ready, I was one of the first people. I got my wife. And now it's like I don't even know where to get one. If you wanted to get one, it seems like perhaps we have to revitalize that whole campaign. But I think UCSD and the chancellor and the med school and everybody and Scripps as well did a phenomenal job. And I want to thank you and in the role that you played, and also our chancellor, as I said. And I'm not just saying that because he's my boss, but anyway.
No, he's a good man. But I also think we're very lucky that we worked together in San Diego. There was no, sense of rivalry. We and the county, the San Diego County. 3.5 million people, second largest in California. We got on this, and so it isn't perfect, but we actually are a model county, like Seattle, Kings County, and a few others around the country that have managed this reasonably well. You've got wastewater surveillance there on campus. We're trying to stay ahead of it. The one thing I regret here is that we didn't get the rapid home testing to every household in San Diego to show the rest of the country that would be so striking in terms of helping to manage. So anytime you're going out, you would be clear that you're not infectious. And we need that now more than ever because some vaccinated people are unknowingly infected.
And what do you make of it, though? I have, people on, other side just to have some potential pushback on some of the messaging that's been gotten. If you have a vaccine, if you're vaccinated, rather double vaccinated, it worked well. why should you have to wear a mask? And I hear that a lot. And I just wanted to get your personal take on it. Because I know you've been kind of atheistic politically too, in that you've pushed back on big pharma in the past, famously against Merck and Vioxx. And now, more recently, kind of just criticizing some of the current CDC messaging. What do you make of that? If you were talking to someone who's bright and just say, this is the first, just stating in fact, it's the first vaccine that you have to, wear a mask after you got vaccinated, and it had some high efficacy and efficiency, as you point out in your interview with Sam. What do you make of that?
Well, here you bring in a little physics with the aerosol transmission, right? And when you have 1,000-fold more viral load, the chance of you being able to override a person who is doubly vaccinated is higher. We're seeing it. We're seeing these so-called breakthroughs, and not just that they get a positive test, but they get symptoms, and some get, quite sick. Obviously, the chance of it is much far lower than if you're unvaccinated. But it's all about the fact that this virus is distinctly worse and different and more challenging. It's daunting. Compared with every prior version. And the other thing is it also has this quality of immune evasiveness. So whereas the prior versions of the virus, the vaccine held up really well, here one dose is like placebo. If you don't have the second dose, you got a lot of vulnerability. So basically the vaccines are leaking. The viral load is overwhelming people. And the other thing is, which is unanticipated, and now we'll get into the weeds of life science. We thought that our B cells and T cells were going to kick in, these on-demand reserve cells, and that we'd be good for years, like 10, 20 years. Now It looks like we're only good for a matter of months, and we have to get boosters. And so it's becoming much more complicated.
In terms of those boosters, I've had friends of mine, actually physicians, just saying like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to go down and if this is misinformation, please correct me." But that they would get another boost, they would just go and get another COVID shot, COVID vaccination. Is that advisable? Is that not recommend? I mean, if it's safe, in other words, they're the reasoning that these physicians have told me, it's safe. We know it's almost as effective as a vaccine has ever been made in human history. As you pointed out, thanks to this immense ingenuity of people around the world, but especially people here locally. And yet it's so safe. So why not just get a third, wouldn't it be prophylactic in a sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's still some unknowns. Like, is this only for people of advanced age and immunocompromised? Is this an across the board thing? Is this like what timing? Is it 6 months, 9 months? I mean, there's a lot of unknowns. So before we start, getting to third boosters, we're learning from Israel, which has started that campaign of a third in the elderly population, but it's a little early to jump to that. Ideally, if this Delta wave could pass pretty quickly, and we won't have to worry about it so much. In some places, its rise is complemented, fortunately, by its rapid fall off. So if we see that, then, and if the virus isn't circulating high levels, then the need for the boosters will be forestalled, and then we can look at it and think about it in the light of day rather than in a panic mode where we have insufficient data right now.
I want to ask you a question that my audience had, but also I had, and actually it was brought to my attention by Andy Weir, the author of The Martian, and more recently Project Hail Mary, which is about a virus that doesn't take over the Earth; it takes over the sun. Anyway, he's a proud dropout of UCSD in the computer science division, where our mutual friend Rajesh Gupta connected you and me together. I thank him very much. Shout out to Rajesh; he's an unbelievable scientist and influence on me. I want to ask you: is this, as Andy said, maybe the last pandemic? In other words, now that we have mRNA, and we have 3D printing, we have CRISPR, we have blah, blah, blah. Is this the last, that it might be a side benefit of COVID that we won't suffer from a global pandemic again?
Well, I'm an optimist, Brian, and I think it's possible that we could markedly reduce the chances that we'll have another pandemic if we have developed stockpiles of universal vaccines against all the candidate viruses. So basically, because of what we now can do with structural biology and with CRISPR and all the tools that we have, we can basically take down all coronaviruses and other viruses that would likely yield a pandemic, such that the moment we saw it start in an outbreak, we would be, at all over it and have the tools to squash it, so that we would never get in this kind of situation again. But that relies on heavy investment in the life science to have those pan virus, all the candidates. There's a list of like 5 or 6 families. And we have the ability now, we're smart enough to know whether it's through natural antibody reverse engineering that people make these incredibly potent antibodies, super antibodies, or whether it's through synthetic means. We could do this, but we have to fund it. We have to, put the resources and the intellectual talent behind it. But I do think the chances will be blunted. It will never be zero. And It could be that the top 5 virus families that we think are it, and we get a surprise, So that's what we should be aiming for right now, is having preparation where we basically have a way to squash this from the get-go.
Another question from a listener or viewer on YouTube who has a name. Actually, I was going to choose from my oldest son, but his name is Stinky Piece of Cheese. And yet he asked she asked, I don't know, it could be a woman, asked a very provocative and interesting question about the future of technology, not just AI, but she asked, other than ECG, pulse oximetry, galvanic response, temperature, and blood insulin and other things, oxygenation. What other non-invasive sensors look promising to provide real-time specific patient data for input?
Oh, I think it's immense, actually. Just voice is a big one. There's going to be ability to for breath, to being able to pick up all the organic molecules in the person's breath. I mean, it's just unlimited. We have all these exhaust fumes as human machines that we aren't.
Some more than others.
Yeah, some more than others that we haven't tapped into yet. So no, I think that the non-invasive sensor world is going to be rich, and we're just barely scratching the surface. And Stinky Piece of Cheese started with a few there, but there's a whole lot more, really.
That's right. And the stinkiness, the breath, maybe could perhaps provide vital clues as to his or her health. Another question from a listener. Second choice for a name for one of my kids, Zero Skull. Okay. Zero Skull asks, is there any such thing as a typical human? I see online often, and maybe I've even seen you retweet this, there'll be some study, like coffee, more than 3 cups of coffee a day kills, you with 100% certainty in 100 years. Yeah. But in mice, it's always in mice. And by the way, I've coined another one. Instead of just say mice, it's just say dust, because dust is responsible for most of the hoaxes and problems in astronomy that we see. But anyway, he's asking, does any human that you've ever encountered or examined meet the physiological, psychological, sociological definition of a typical human? And if not, is that a problem?
Yeah, well, I think that's the principle of individualized medicine, that every one of us is unique, biologically, anatomically, our environment, physiologically, every layer, we are unique. So that's why, in many respects, we try to dumb down medicine with the clinical trial. In the clinical trial, that's the sanctimonious clinical trial where you have 10 people out of 100 derive benefit, right?
Right.
And then you treat everyone with that treatment. Well, what about the 90 that don't have benefit, right? So we have basically all these pills that people are taking every day, and we don't even know if they benefit, because are they like the 5 or the 10 out of 100 that do benefit? Or are they like the 90 or the 80, 85 that don't? I mean, we are so stupid. We have to be smarter than this, because the waste is profound, right? And it isn't just the cost; it's also exposure to side effects, and taking some pill for the rest of your life, and so many. So we have to do better than this to understand, and that's part of the deep medicine principle, is deep phenotyping, that we understand each person at this kind of multidimensional way, and we can do that now. We just aren't doing it.
Question from a 4th-year medical student named Nicholas Premiano. I can't believe that's his real name. His real name has got to be, like oblong football and anyway, no, this is a real person with a real picture. Nicholas asks you, and this is related, I think, to your conversation with Sam Harris. You talked about the vaccine reporting system and how it's over-reporting adverse events by 3 orders of magnitude. This is according to him. I'm just taking his word for it. I have no reason to suspect that he wouldn't. But he said, is it okay to exaggerate health issues in the name of greater good of public safety? And actually, I've thought about this too. It was admitted not too long ago that that some breast cancer advocacy group, advocated that all women get mammograms or anyway, there was a controversy about mammograms, I remember very strikingly, and secondhand smoke, and which you did mention with Sam as an example of like something that, is not really transmissible. Anyway, there was a long ago, the American Lung Association, had statistics like, you're 20 times more likely to die of secondhand smoke. And now we don't really talk about it because it was so successful. And obviously, women getting early screening and surveillance for breast cancer is a net positive, and people not smoking and not impacting people with secondhand smoke is a benefit. Now, the question I think Nicholas is asking is, to what extent is it okay to exaggerate medical benefits in the name of public health? I know you're not a public health, necessarily.
Well, but I think you touched on mammography, and that's a great example because the benefits have been grossly exaggerated. So if you take 10,000 women, the prototypic risk at age 50, and you have them get a mammogram every year for 10 years, you find out that there's a 60% false positive rate. Yeah. With all these poor women that are told there's something abnormal. Many of them get biopsies. Some of them even get treated in surgery. So you have all these false positives for the very small few people that you've helped, right? A few over the course of a decade. So when you exaggerate things, the implications from a public health standpoint are profound. It's kind of like the algorithm that goes into scale in people, and there's a glitch in it, and you can hurt a lot of people real quickly. That's what you can do if you exaggerate the benefits or the harms. Now, when I was talking about the vaccine adverse event recording system, that was the same sort of thing, is exaggerating the harms, because none of these reported things are reviewed or adjudicated, and so a lot of them have nothing to do with the vaccine. In fact, most. So we have to be accurate again with this, whether it's a particular intervention, screening. The results of a treatment like the vaccines, all these things require accuracy. And when they're loose, we got problems.
So last question from the audience has to do with whether or not, I don't know why he's asking you this, but he's asking you, is there a moral imperative rather for humans to colonize other planets?
Well, that's an interesting question. I listened to Jeff Bezos on his recent little adventure about how important it is, and how it will be the way to save the planet, and a lot of theoretical things, right? Maybe I can see it as a potential thing. I think the problem, and this is where I got involved a little bit with the Kelly brothers, the traveling in space for human beings, we're not fit. We're not fit to be. If you go hang out in the ISS for any undue period of time, or try to take a little trip to Mars, it's going to really have a big hit on your body. And we don't know who are what's the right genome and right people that are going to withstand that hit. I mean, humans weren't meant for this. So there's some trade-offs, Brian. I think there's some benefits potentially, but we haven't weighed the toll it takes on Scott Kelly when he was compared to his brother, Mark, who never left, so it's an unknown. And I think we have some of these, between Branson and Musk and Bezos, we have these incredible advocates, but I don't think we've carefully considered some of the trade-offs to the human toll on your body.
Yeah. No, I agree. And just as a point of reference, I had Jessica Mayer, who's from the other Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I interviewed her live while she was on the ISS, and she seemed to be doing well. She enjoyed her hair kind of floating around, but she answered questions from middle school and high school kids around the county. And then I had Lord Martin Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal and tells the queen her horoscope, I guess. But anyway, he was on the show and he said, yes, Elon told me that he wants to die on Mars. And I said, I just hope it's not on impact. So we're going to go into the impossible, which is when I do questions only for my members and subscribers. And I don't want to deny my non-members and non-subscribers the opportunity to hear just your last thoughts about COVID, what this wave is likely to do, any implications, any implorations. What do you think? What would you like to leave the vast majority of my audience with today?
Well, like I said, Brian, I'm an optimist, and I have watched the other countries where this wave, it was severe, but it passed through relatively quickly, shorter than prior, partly because the virus is so incredibly efficient, burns through populations, and then it can't find hosts and it retreats, partly because in some places we've had, good vaccination to help give some line of defense. So I'm hoping that in the next several weeks, it'll be passed. But I don't know what lurks after that. I don't know whether it'll come back, whether we'll see a worse variant. I'm hoping not. I mean, this is pretty darn bad, damn bad. So let's just hope that we're over the biggest hump, because eventually there is the worry that we could see a virus with even more immune evasiveness and make our vaccines look even weaker. Yeah. So let's hope that we don't see that.
Yeah. So I think we're both encouraging people, if they meet the requirements, to get vaccinated and take the proper precautions and not be too, I always think being an optimist is dangerous and being a pessimist is dangerous because they can both lead you to inaction. But I want to thank you, Dr. Eric Topol of the Scripps Institute and institution. I always get the two of them. Scripps Research Institution. That's the way I'll remember it. I want to thank you so much. And if you'll indulge me, I have 5 more minutes of questions just for my members and audience called Into the Impossible. We'll ask some final big philosophical picture questions. But for now, Eric, thank you so much for going into the impossible.
Thank you.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
If you enjoyed this video, I know you'll love my interview with Peter Diamandis, a fellow doctor and proponent of all things technical applied to medicine. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to receive Eric's answers to my thrilling 3 final existential questions. You'll need to go over to my website to sign up, briankeating.com.